talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hour, I've been identifying as Nigel. And now, I'm still the same gender, you'll be pleased to know, but I'm identifying as Jacob. I guess at some point this evening I'll re-identify as myself. But Jacob is in a taxi, he's been voting in the House of Commons, he is racing here as quickly as the traffic and the protesters will allow him. We've got a full-on show. He will be here shortly, I absolutely promise you. We'll be continuing, obviously, a coverage of today's news, about the Supreme Court's ruling, about the Rwanda policy. It's a no from the judges. And of course, we're very interested to take a serious look at the new Home Secretary, Mr. James Cleverly. What actually is his record on immigration, be it lawful or unlawful? Can he be trusted? Hopefully when Jacob arrives, he'll also give you his takes on the developments with regard to the Prime Minister's plan. Is it enough to stop the boats? You heard me talking earlier about the lawyers. They don't think it's going to fly at all. Also, it's not just the Conservative government that's found itself in hot spots. The Labour Party, in a little bit of a split over the question of the Israeli-Hamas ceasefire votes in the Commons literally just moments ago. 4 Labour front benchers have already resigned from the shadow cabinet. Is that it, or is there more to come? Good news. We all need a bit of good news. Yes, for the Prime Minister, he promised he would halve inflation, and it's actually happened. Yes. Inflation, give or take, has halved. The question is it down to him, or is it down to other factors like just global energy bills? So 1 down, 4 more to go. And lastly, Jacob will be joined later in the show by the author Mark Hollingsworth on an amazing new book, Agents of Influence, A Secret History of the KGB. That's all coming up on State of the Nation, but first, it's the news once again with Polly Middlehurst.
Richard, thank you. Well, there were 2 votes in the House of Commons tonight. Sir Keir Starmer said there should be longer pauses in the fighting in Israel and Gaza to allow for humanitarian aid to reach those who need it. But the SNP had tabled an amendment to the King's speech, and they wanted a complete ceasefire. We saw crowds outside Westminster demanding the very same thing. Well, the outcome of that second vote was that MPs voted 293 to 125. That's a majority of 168 to reject the SNP's King's Speech amendment, calling for all parties to go for a ceasefire in Gaza. Let's get analysis on that now with our political correspondent, Catherine Foster, who watched it all happen. First of all, Catherine, tell us what happened with the earlier Labour vote. Keir Starmer was facing something of rebellion, wasn't he?
Yes, Keir Starmer put this Labour amendment forward, hoping that that would be enough to stave off a big rebellion regarding a ceasefire. The SNP amendment calling actively for a ceasefire. The Labour leadership had said explicitly that is not their position. But his efforts have really failed because tonight 56 Labour MPs defied the Labour leadership and voted with the SNP for a ceasefire. Now, to put that into context, there's 198 MPs, Labour MPs, currently in the House of Commons. So that's just over a quarter of them defied Sir Keir Starmer. And in terms of Labour front benchers, 8 frontbenchers voted against the Labour leadership. 7 of them have already resigned. The other one will almost certainly be sacked. Of those, many of them fairly junior ministers, but I think the best known one probably, Jess Phillips. She is a shadow Minister for Domestic Violence and Safeguarding. So a real challenge to Sir Keir Starmer's authority. Rishi Sunak is not the only person having a problem controlling his own party.
Catherine Foster in Westminster, thanks very much indeed. Well, the other main story in the news today, the Prime Minister is saying he'll introduce emergency legislation to deem Rwanda a safe country and prevent legal challenges in the future. It comes after the Supreme Court this morning ruled the government's Rwanda plan was unlawful. Rishi Sunak said he didn't agree with the ruling and respected it. Mr Sunak says the European Court of Human Rights would still be able to intervene in any new treaty they agree with Kigali in Rwanda, but critically, they won't be able to block those flights on their way to Rwanda. He says he will do all he can to bring fundamental change, though, to the country.
We are a reasonable government, and this is a reasonable country. But the British people's patience can only be stretched so thin, and they expect the boats to be stopped. That is why I made it one of my 5 priorities. And whatever our critics might say, we are making progress. Because the Rwanda scheme is only one part of our strategy. Last December, the number entering the UK illegally in small boats had more than quadrupled in just 2 years.
Well, in other news today, 2 12-year-old boys have been arrested on suspicion of murder after a 19-year-old was stabbed to death in Wolverhampton. 19-year-old Sean Sihai was attacked on Laburnham Road on Monday night. A number of police vehicles and officers remain at the scene, and West Midlands Police say 2 boys were arrested at their home addresses. They remain in custody. Some good news. The government says it has delivered on its pledge to halve inflation, with price rises slowing down at the fastest rate in 2 years. The latest data showing inflation was 4.6% in October. That's down from 6.7% in September. A fall in energy costs and house prices has helped reduce that figure, which, though, is still above the Bank of England's 2% target. That's the news. This is GB News, across the UK on TV, in your car, on digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. This is Britain's news channel.
Well, here we are. Yes, I am Richard Tice. I'm sort of identifying as Sir Jacob, but actually, he's in a taxi and we're going live to him now. Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg, where are you? What's going on? Why are you late?
I'm late because we were voting on the King's speech and the government won all the votes. I'm now only about 250 yards away, so I am racing thanks to a brilliant black cab driver who's brought me here as swiftly as possible. What was it Disraeli said about black taxis being the gondolas of London? So I've been coming in a London gondola to get here.
Fantastic, Jacob. The gondolas of London. Well, this is the only chance I'll probably ever get to identify as a knight, but I'm delighted to be joined in this studio by Tessa Dunlop and also Kelvin Mackenzie. Whilst we're waiting for Jacob to arrive, I just want to look at James Cleverly's record, actually. He's the new Home Secretary, and obviously the Prime Minister says that he's serious about stopping the boats, he's serious about reducing immigration numbers. What's James Cleverly's record of talking about immigration? Tessa, have you ever heard him talk about immigration?
Well, just quickly, more broadly on James Cleverly, if I may just, can I have 1 second on his personality? Because I happen to share fireworks night with quite a high-up wonk in the Foreign Office, Commonwealth and Development, who was absolutely extolling his virtues. This was before he'd been moved to the Home Office, saying he was easy to work with, took a brief,
lovely.
One of the most popular among the white blob.
That's lovely.
Thank you.
But what do you know about him as someone who wants to control immigration and stop the boats?
Interestingly, he was early on behind Boris Johnson for this Rwanda scheme, which sees him plummet in my popularity, but I expect will play well among your viewers. He was a keen Brexiteer before
They're actually your viewers as well.
Before the term had even been coined. Hi there, Kelvin. How are we?
So, hang on. Now, back in 2017, Kelvin, just in a vote on Brexit, James Cleverly said, we understand that some communities in Britain are concerned about the migration and we have to respond to those concerns. He then said, we need to explain, i.e. educate, the value that international migration brings to the British economy. This doesn't sound to me like someone who's worried about immigration and wants to control it and stop the boats.
Well, he's a politician. He will worry about anything that will do him any good, to be honest. So I think he actually is pretty equivocal about ECHR and what the country should do about it. He makes that quite clear. In fact, he says, I am hostile to ditching it. So he's going to be in competition and in contrast to the Prime Minister. So let's see.
Well, hang on. Is he really, or actually, is he basically adopting the Prime Minister's real position, and that actually Suella Braverman was against the
I think you're right, and if you look at his track record in the Foreign Office in Europe, he's an appeaser. He's actually built some significant bridges in Europe, and I don't think he's want to go on in there like some kind of freedom fighter attacking the European Court of Human Rights. That is not his gig. It's not what he wants to do. And it was Rishi Sunak today that ratcheted up the temperature totally unnecessarily. Rishi had been felled by his own English common law, and yet he was going, we're not going to let foreign courts stop us sending flights to Rwanda.
Yeah, but he's got an election that he wants to win.
Sure.
He's behind in the polls.
Yes.
And he knows that his voters
want migration
he's
running into a very difficult area here.
He is.
Because were the courts to reject, honestly, our courts in this country have absolutely no connection with ordinary people. But if the courts were to reject his next idea, right, he is absolutely done for coming to the election. And I noticed a GBNews poll tonight suggesting that we are now down to, or the Conservatives are now down to 20%, which is the Liz Truss area.
The poll last night, it came out at 9 o'clock last night, was they were down to 19%.
Right. And so what I did like about him on tonight was that he was bloody bad-tempered, Rishi, about this. And that's the first time I've kind of seen the mask begin to drop, because he recognises the danger to himself. And I haven't seen that before in him. When you start seeing them being bad-tempered, which was what I loved about Thatcher, is she began to
But maybe he's bad-tempered because he realises actually Suella Braverman was right. No. He should have had a plan B, he should have had a plan C, and now he's talking about new legislation that he should have already had, a plan B legislation that he should have had in place, Tessa.
It's an absolute nonsense, and I think Jacob Mogg has agreed with this on me in the past.
Jacob Mogg?
That one, the one who's not here. It's a jazz hands thing, this. According to Rishi's own figures today, he said this himself, we have sent back 20,000 asylum seekers who didn't cut the mustard. When small boats, the number's coming across a little more than about 25,000.
Hold on a second.
That means that we don't even need Rwanda. We don't need it. It will cost, even if we get it through the courts and excluding the legal bills that we're going to have to pay, over £100,000 per person to send someone to Rwanda.
But Tessa, there's over 150,000 asylum seekers still waiting. The 20,000 number is irrelevant. There'll be another 20 to 30,000 coming over next year. I've just had two lawyers...
Rwanda's a distraction.
I've just had two lawyers, very senior lawyers, both say that his plan to have declare Rwanda a safe country will not pass the mustard in the Court of Appeal or the Supreme Court.
Right, but he's got to do something, hasn't he? What is he going to do? Are we... Actually, what we should do is pass some really vile legislation which means that when he says something, it gets delivered, because every time he says something and it's not delivered, right, he actually goes backward in the polls.
Absolutely.
People do feel strongly about tens of thousands.
No, but it is a democracy where actually, if you're elected to carry out a manifesto of reducing reducing immigration and you increase immigration, don't be surprised if the voters turn you out.
But the increase of migration has been predominantly legal migration. 1.5 million people legally allowed into this country.
They're both out of control. They're completely out of control.
Arguably, actually, the numbers coming in on small boats, it's just because we see them in boats now. Before we voted for Brexit, they used to come in under lorries, etc. But now the checks
So you were in favour of that, were you?
They get in boats. I'm not in favour of it. I'm just explaining.
Well, it doesn't need explaining.
You don't care. You don't care.
I do care.
We're going to have to wrap it. But, so basically, Tessa, you don't care that billions of pounds of taxpayers' cash is being spent housing and accommodating these people. Hold that thought there, folks, because I'm going to thank my panel. I'm in charge. I'm in charge. I'm Sir Jacob.
He's got the mic.
Coming up, we'll be hearing on the Rwanda ruling from Sir Jacob himself. He will be arriving imminently. In fact, I'm told he's in the building. Plus, some more on Labour's resignations. Stay tuned here on GB News.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh!
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Could you be quiet? What is this? It's my new teeth. It's your new teeth.
I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you. Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months. That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News,
the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Thank you very much to Richard for standing in for me. I'm the real Jacob Rees-Mogg, though I thought he did a very good impression. If you want to mail Mogg saying that he was better, you're free to do so. But otherwise, just mail Mogg to say thank you to him for doing sterling work. Anyway, the news of the day. Following this morning's Supreme Court decision that the Rwanda policy is unlawful, the Prime Minister this afternoon announced government plans to introduce emergency legislation to declare Rwanda a safe country. He also said he will not allow a foreign court to block the deportation flights. Here's what he had to say late this afternoon.
We'll take the extraordinary step of introducing emergency legislation. I told Parliament earlier today that I'm prepared to change our laws and revisit those international relationships to remove the obstacles in our way. So let me tell everybody now, I will not allow a foreign court to block these flights. When I said I would stop the boats, I meant it. Today's judgment has not weakened my resolve, it has only hardened it, and we will deliver that too.
The court, the Supreme Court, which incidentally isn't a foreign court, upheld the Court of Appeal's ruling earlier this year that Rwanda cannot be considered a safe country, owing to the substantial grounds for believing that asylum seekers would face a real risk of ill treatment by reason of refoulement. Refoulement is that they would be returned to the country from which they were seeking to leave because they were refugees. This was all explained in the judgment of the Supreme Court. But it's important to remember the ruling relates to UK's domestic laws passed through Parliament. The UK does not necessarily need to withdraw from the European Court of Human Rights to overturn this ruling. The ruling reflects the compatibility of the Rwanda policy with our own law. There is no superior law in this country since we left the European Union. There are international agreements, but no international agreement can override UK law because of the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty. So the issue here is the international treaties, of which the UK is a signatory, are sometimes reflected in our domestic law. We have a dualist system. We sign up to international law, but it can only have effect if Parliament says it can. In other words, laws such as the Human Rights Act 1998 and others that reinforce the international treaties, such as the Refugee Convention and the European Convention of Human Rights, are the laws that end up blocking the Rwanda policy. Our judges cannot enforce foreign law. They can only enforce domestic law since we left the European Union. So, if we're to make Rwanda work, we must amend those domestic laws, and in doing so, override international obligations, which anyway don't have courts particularly that can interpret them. The European Convention of Human Rights does, but international treaties don't necessarily. As the Prime Minister said, he will not allow a foreign court to block deportations, but this isn't particularly relevant because it's been blocked by a domestic court. Historically, we've ignored the ECHR, as we did on prisoner voting rights, when for 10 years or more we didn't do what they wanted us to do. And we could do the same for the question of Rwanda. But there is something quite telling about this ruling. Suella Braverman's scathing letter to the Prime Minister alleged that in exchange for her support during the leadership contest, Prime Minister promised to include notwithstanding clauses to small boats legislation that would block the operation of the aforementioned domestic laws that inhibit the Rwanda policy. In fact, looking into some old amendments, we found 2 of them that earlier this year would have done exactly this. As you can see, this amendment stipulates that the section in question will have effect notwithstanding rulings from the ECHR or other international law obligations. And this other amendment would have blocked the operation of the Human Rights Act 1998. These amendments would have meant that the Supreme Court would have ruled in favour of Rwanda had they passed. But the government, Prime Minister, did not support them, so they did not pass. And the question is, will Rishi Sunak now do enough? Is he willing to exercise the sovereign will of Parliament, or will it go off half-cocked once again? As always, I want to hear from you, mailmog@gbnews.com. But I'm very pleased to be joined by the immigration lawyer, Ivan Sampson. Ivan, thank you for coming in again. The Supreme Court ruled on UK domestic law that the plan to deport people to Rwanda was not lawful. That's correct, isn't it?
Not strictly, no. The principle of non-refoulement is within the Refugee Convention under Article 33. So it made reference to that principle.
But that principle can only apply if it's brought into UK law through the Human Rights Act. It can't apply simply because the government has signed up to an international treaty. Our law doesn't work like that. We have a dualist system.
I think you're not interpreting it correctly. We are obliged under the asylum system we have, we incorporate all of
that's the key.
All of the Refugee Convention principles in our domestic legislation.
That's the key. That it's international law does not have effect in the UK unless it has a domestic legal base. That's the key thing I'm trying to get at and to explain.
I mean, we could have a new Act of Parliament which says ignore the Refugee Convention.
Yeah, that's right.
A simple act like that, you could pass it through the court, through Parliament. But is that what we want to do? Is that the right look for this country internationally to ignore our obligations to international treaties?
But the question here are you with the Lord Chief Justice, who basically said that he thought it was not right for the courts to replace the judgment of the executive on whether Rwanda was safe, or the Supreme Court that decided that the UN refugee body had more standing than His Majesty's government, which seems to me a bizarre position for a court to take, actually.
You know, one of your colleagues said this afternoon, I won't mention it, an MP, on another channel, that we should have elected Supreme Court judges. And that way we can control what they do. We'll put our judges into the court so they do what we tell them to do. That's not what the Supreme Court is about.
America does that.
America does that. They want a similar system in the US. But look, the Supreme Court judges unequivocally, they declared in their judgment that Rwanda's not safe, having looked at all the evidence.
Yes.
Now, just because Parliament says, ignoring the evidence, let's ignore the evidence, I'd like to see you go to Rwanda, please bear with me, have a placard which says, Paul Kagame out. And let's see what happens to you, Jacob. You would be banged up in 2 seconds.
Yes, but Parliament has a democratic mandate to make the laws of the land. The judges are there to implement the laws Parliament has imposed. Isn't that right? You would agree with that?
Yes, but
yes. And so
within the law. And
there is no law beyond Parliament.
There is a higher law, Jacob.
There is not a higher law.
There is a higher law called the Universal Law of Human Rights.
There is not a universal law of human rights.
Well, this argument can't ignore people's rights because Parliament will.
This argument was lost in the 16th century. You're making an argument that I'm not unsympathetic to. Is the argument made by Thomas More, who made the argument for natural law. He lost. He was executed. The principle of parliamentary sovereignty, as set out by Dicey, is the basis of our constitution, and it means our law is rooted in democracy rather than judges who, in the US, when you give final power to the judges, become deeply politicised.
The will of the people is how Parliament gets into power. The will of the people today, Jacob, is that you've got 20% of the will of the people. If we had an election today, you'd probably be out of work.
Well,
so, you know, let's talk about the will of the people. It's certainly not with the government.
It is on this particular issue.
Well,
the opinion polling on this. And we have a parliamentary system so that the government has a mandate for 5 years.
Yes.
So I don't think you can change the mandate on every opinion poll. You'd never have any government at all. So you don't really mean that, do you?
No, of course not. But I don't believe that the support that you say is there for these policies is there. I don't believe that. I think the British people are fair-minded. They want to give protection to the right people, but they also want the government to remove those people that shouldn't be here. Now, if the government did that, we wouldn't be in this
But the UN itself is processing Libyan refugees in Rwanda, so it's quite happy to do it itself. It thinks Rwanda's safe to do that, but it's not safe for the UK to do it.
I stand by the judgment of the Supreme Court, and that's decided that it's not lawful for them to send people to a country which we don't trust.
But it is lawful for Parliament to override that, because our law in this country comes from Parliament.
Well, I think
you may not like it, you may think it's distasteful, but Parliament is entitled to do that.
I don't believe the MPs in Parliament will do that. I think there'll be enough opposition to this abhorrent law, which is going to cost us about £85 million to send these people to Rwanda. And did you know, for every person...
It's costing us £8 million to keep them in hotels. But
because
I'm afraid we're going to have
for every person that goes to Rwanda, they can send one back.
We do have to stop, but thank you, Ivan. GB News is the People's channel, and Vox Populi Vox Dei. We asked the people what they thought about the Supreme Court ruling, and the people have spoken.
I think something has to be done. They have to be deterred, and it would take 2 or 3 weeks of them being really deterred, and they wouldn't come.
What's the point of the government trying to do anything if they're going to be overruled every time, no matter what they do? That is not a government. They are just a lot of people on a large expense account, on a damn good wage, sitting there, waffling on about all and sundry and doing nothing.
The idea was good, but I didn't think the courts would allow it, because it's just the way things go. The do-gooders seem to run everything.
Well, with me now is the former editor of the Evening Standard, Emily Sheffield. Emily, thank you very much for coming in.
Not at all. Thank you for having me.
Well, that's a delight. The government is in a difficult position, isn't it? That the court has ruled, and the House of Lords is not going to be very easy to get emergency legislation through.
It's not, but I think they should keep trying. I think that it's been made quite clear that to stop the boats, and these are illegal crossings, people drowning, and I remember writing a column 2 years ago now when we had a vast amount of people drown off this coast and people get incredibly upset by that, is that we need a very wide set of deterrents. And that is going to include, I think, a scheme like Rwanda, even if they can't get Rwanda to work. They need to work with other countries to stop the criminal gangs, but that on its own, we've had people who run the border policing system saying we need deterrence. And it has been a bad day for the Tories, I understand that, but unlike Labour, they really are trying to stop the boats. They have reduced them by 33% already. I understand that many people in the country have got deep concerns about Rwanda and its history of how it treats other immigrants there and migrants there. It's not got a terribly good record, and that's what the Supreme Court was bringing up. I think it's a very complex issue to explain to the British public. Not many people understand the issue of befoulment, and I know you spend a lot of time on this programme trying to talk to people about how complex this issue is.
It's not a word I'd come across before today, and
No, me neither. I had to look it
I've
up.
got a reasonable vocabulary.
Much better than mine.
I doubt that. But with Albania, there has been quite a success. So Albanians crossing get sent back.
33% down, I believe.
And that the deterrent effect is everything. And you're so right to mention the deaths, that there is a consequence of this illegal people trafficking. It is that people die. It's not just that people get across and are living in hotels. It's the real danger to the refugees themselves.
No, I'm in complete agreement. And I think what many people watching this show, and you will of course remember, is that when David Cameron was Prime Minister, there was a huge problem with the tunnels and people coming off in trucks, under trains, and again, people were dying, suffocating in trucks. And that was an easier problem to solve. It took a number of years. It took a lot of work with the French. That was stopped. Unfortunately, that pushed them onto the beaches. And as you know, and as I know, and as many people watching this programme, that is far harder to police.
And the experience of Australia is that deterrents work. That as soon as people realise they're not going to be able to land and not being able to get asylum in the UK, in the case of Australia, they stop coming.
Yes. The one thing I think, it was in the manifesto to an Australian-style point system.
But that's on legal migration. And interestingly, when Australia stopped illegal migration, its legal migration went up. I don't think we can do that because ours is already so high at 606,000
Rishi
last year.
Sunak has said that he will allow more in, but he wants to do it legally, because I think that was a real issue with a lot of voters. They don't want to feel we're just pulling the
Well, I thought one of the best things we did in relation to Syria was take Syrian refugees directly from Syrian refugee camps, which mainly obviously immediately outside Syria. So you brought in genuinely vulnerable people rather than the young men who had saved the money to come across. I thought that was a much better approach.
I think it is a much better approach. I do think that probably a lot of voters in this country, though, feel that we are sometimes a bit mean with the amount that we let in, and I think that is something that maybe should be put to the people in the next election. I do think I think a lot of people become very concerned about immigration when it directly impacts them. They've got those waiting in hotels nearby. They feel that maybe their own schools, there aren't enough houses being built. So that is hard. I think the British people are unbelievably
I think that's
generous.
right, and we've been generous to Hong Kong and Ukraine, as we rightly should have been.
Incredibly. Maybe not enough to some to Afghanistan.
We've got to end. But, Emily, thank you very much. Coming up, the Labour ceasefire row in shoes, with frontbench Labour MPs breaking ranks and voting against the party line. But will Sir Keir hold strong? Plus, State of the Nation's book club returns with today's focus on how the KGB subverts Western democracy. All sorts of exciting things coming up.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't
hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only three people you can trust in life: your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquia, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Could you be quiet? What is this? It's my new teeth. It's your new teeth.
I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes & Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is two new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. We've been discussing the Supreme Court's Rwanda ruling, and we've had some of your views. Mike, legal aid for British subjects only. Stopping legal aid will stop produce illegal immigration. Alan, Starmer is so weak, sits on the fence like his shadow cabinet. How can he be trusted to make a decision? And Peter, for a fraction of the cost of what the UK spent on Rwanda, we could have built a totally safe tent city for illegal migrants on the British island of Ascension. Peter, I'm so sorry we couldn't. I looked at the cost of this when I was in government and we just couldn't. Well, it's been a tumultuous day not just for the Prime Minister, but also for the leader of the opposition. Sir Keir Starmer was reportedly laying down the law after sources claim he would sack MPs who vote in favour of an SNP amendment calling for an Israeli ceasefire in Gaza. But it seems he didn't have to. 4 shadow ministers have resigned from the shadow group over the vote on the ceasefire in Gaza, including Shadow Exports Minister Afzal Khan and the Shadow Women and Equalities Minister Yasmin Qureshi, who is a really excellent lady who's done wonderful work on Primados. But the question is, will Sir Keir hold strong on his position or succumb to the rebels? Well, I've got an excellent panel to talk about this with. Tessa, thank you for coming in, as always. Do you think Sir Keir will hold strong? Do you think the rebels are right? 56 Labour MPs voted against, plus Jeremy Corbyn, Diane Abbott and the few others who have had the whip taken away.
Yes, a quarter of his party, effectively.
Oh, and Jess Phillips has also resigned.
Yeah, and I think my own MP, Helen Hayes, Shadow Children's Minister, I believe she was going to vote in favour of a ceasefire, so I'm presuming she will have stepped down. For example, the likes of Jess Phillips and Helen Hayes, and Jess Phillips was candid about this. I'm voting with my heart and also with my constituents. And I would say the same applies for Helen Hayes.
But Jess is one of the most charismatic members of the Labour frontbench team. That's a real loss for the Labour Party. I'm biased because I like her, but... And
I'm actually, I think also Helen's gone up in my estimation. And I think if your local MP takes a stand, suddenly you sort of sit up and notice them a bit, don't you? But in terms of where Keir's positioned, I went and watched that enormous march on Saturday. I watched them file past and I was staggered by its size. But also the numbers of people holding the socialist worker placards. And the question is the extent to which this will lead to a fallout at the ballot box for Labour because he can reshuffle his front bench a bit. He can patch over it. People can be forgiven. Look at Suella Braverman. How many times has she bounced back before she suddenly bounced out? So I think he will recover. For many, there is disappointment, I think, that he doesn't feel able to go with what are probably his inner convictions.
But Kelvin, isn't he absolutely right that if it's the socialist workers whose banners are being carried at the march, he's got to disassociate himself with the hard left?
Well, I think, after all, I think at the end there might be 8 of the front bench.
Right, OK, so it's gone up as we've been speaking.
Had to go down. And, of course, what this actually shows is something rather more serious for Labour than just this particular mixing of words. What it shows is that, in effect, Islam, Muslims, the Muslim voters, are actually organising the Labour Party. And actually, the Labour Party has not got a view in many areas which, if it conflicts with their Muslim voters, they have to bow at the knee to. So, because if they didn't do, as with Jess Phillips, which is a predominantly Muslim voting area, she wouldn't get in at the next general election. So for Starmer, right now, yes, it just looks like a little local difficulty. Actually, if you carried on seeing the number of Muslim voters in our country increasing...
We're going to have bring Tessa back in. She's about to burst.
Well, I'm just tutting with disappointment. It's such a reductive way of looking at it.
Well, go on, explain why it's wrong. Explain why it is always those Muslim voting constituencies that have forced their Labour MPs out of office.
It's not only. Jess Phillips is a case in point where she has a large number of Muslim constituencies.
And so are about 6 of the others.
But actually, as I mentioned, there were a lot of people in that enormous march who weren't Muslim, who were carrying banners, who were out there because they're appalled by the images that they see on their television
Well, we're not talking about them. We're talking about those that have actually stood
to my politically
voted.
engaged American friends, they think this won't continue in its current form much longer because Biden won't be able to contain his own Democratic
Well, we're not
party.
I'm not worried about the US. I'm not worried about the US. I'm worried about that the Labour Party cannot control, cannot have an idea at the top. The leader of the Labour Party cannot have an idea at the top, which doesn't mean he has to bow to the
but he's not bad.
Muslim
so
voters.
I don't know why you're complaining, because he's done the exact opposite. He's not bad. I would have liked to have seen him lent in to the way that huge numbers, millions of people.
But you know why he didn't, though, don't you?
I do know why he didn't.
You know why he didn't?
He needs to look like the statesman in waiting.
Because
I know why he didn't.
he doesn't want to. He doesn't want to look as though he personally is going to bow to the knee to this. I admire what he's doing, but he has to face the reality that as the Muslim voters grow in our country, the Labour Party will be in hock.
I can assure you.
Well, they're in hock to them right now, aren't they?
They're not in hock to them. They're not. A few MPs.
Okay, analyse the constituencies of their shadow cabinet.
I'm going to appeal to reason, and I never thought I'd say that turning to Jacob. But 56 constituent MPs, and you're not suggesting that in all those constituencies the Muslims swing the vote. They don't. It's a nonsense. You are talking rubbish.
There's 3.2 million.
56 MPs, and that must be right. That there's a small number of constituencies where there's a large Muslim vote,
but not the majority.
But not 56, Kelvin. To be fair, but 56 is a very big rebellion.
They are those who have decided, actually, at the top end of the party to go, have recognised that if they don't go, they won't get elected at the next election. It's as simple as that.
Right. Well, I think we've settled that and brought sweetness and light to that particular subject. So we're going to move on to the good news of today. There is sometimes good news. People complain there's any bad news on telly. We've got good news on telly. Inflation has sharply fallen to 4.6%, the lowest rate in 2 years. Means one of the 5 of Rishi Sunak's pledges has been met, even earlier than expected. The Prime Minister's target was for inflation to be half by the end of the year, and he's done it in November. One of the main reasons for this is the energy price cap, limiting how much suppliers can charge their customers. Well, Kelvin, this is really important to people, isn't it? The cost of living is key.
It's good news
for government's fortunes, but it just makes everybody that little bit better off.
OK, so that's good news. Inevitably, it may take 6 months, 2 quarters, I think Lagarde said the other day. We're going to see interest rates come down. That will have 2 effects. One, your mortgage is in better shape, and also, people... The big bet in people's lives is their house, right? And there have been some dramatic increases for a certain number of people to the point where You know, they're saying, oh, my God, I can't take any more. So that's good news. I believe that we are actually going to have a very good year next year because Israel is going to end and they're going to be win. I think Ukraine will settle down, and I think our economy will be in better shape than it has been.
Well, if those two things happen, then energy prices will come down, inflation will fall quite sharply, and interest rates can be cut quite a bit.
Well, this is one gamble that paid off for Rishi, one of his 5 promises. I mean, presumably he knew that energy prices were likely to plummet towards the end of this year. Sadly, we've not felt the effect in our pockets because the bung that we got from your government last year, we're no longer getting this year, and food pricing hasn't gone down. As for interest rates coming down, I'm surprised that you're predicting that when no major economist is. So it's good that you've got a
I said
crystal
2
ball.
quarters, right?
Okay, 2
in
more
the spring
quarters,
of next year,
we'll check in.
you would expect that to be right.
It's still quite a tough winter. I did think it was very sad for the Conservative Party today when they had such good news, although you could argue it's the low-hanging fruit in terms of getting inflation down, what they've plucked so far. But I did feel sorry for them that there's this major, significant fall in inflation, and, the Rwanda scheme took it totally out of the headlines.
Well, that's politics for you, but there is good news, and we should celebrate when we have good news. But thank you to my brilliant panel. They are as feisty as ever, and we'll see them again next week. Coming up, State of the Nation Book Club returns, and we're talking about the KGB, Russian spies.
On Patrick Christie's tonight, 9 till 11 p.m, find out what happened when I came under attack at a pro-Palestine protest.
Absolutely no one to get away from here. I just want to get away from here. No, go away. You're fascist scum. You're not wanted.
Really? I just want to know your views, that's all.
Plus, Lee Anderson reacts to Rishi's pledge to get Rwanda flights off the ground, and Angela Levin drops a Prince Harry bombshell. Patrick Christie's tonight, 9 till 11 p.m. Be there.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you. Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months. That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK. Here comes a train. Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa!
Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. We've been discussing the Labour ceasefire row and the halving of inflation, and we've had some of your views. Wonderful one from Mark. I'm surprised you took a horseless carriage to the studio tonight. I thought a sedan chair would have been your preferred mode of transportation. They're hard to get nowadays. And Bob says at least Kelvin has his head screwed on right. He's absolutely right. So thank you for sending those messages in. And now it's time for the book club. In the ever-evolving landscape of espionage literature, few authors command the stage with the mastery and finesse of Mark Hollingsworth. The investigative journalist returns with his latest work, Agents of Influence, which outlines how the KGB undermined Western democracy. Well, joining me now to discuss this book is Mark himself. Mark, thank you so much for coming in.
My pleasure.
The KGB has obviously now morphed into a new organisation, but the KGB's history of interference, of compromising people, of bribing people, is quite extraordinary.
Yes, I think if you trace the history of the KGB, they were set out, obviously officially they were established in 1954, but you can trace it back to the 1917, just after the revolution, when Lenin set up the Cheka. And from its beginnings, from its origins, they believed in disinformation and deception. Lenin once said that to tell the truth is a bourgeois concept. And so that was their original plan. Even the Cheka was a brutal, ruthless secret police, but the core mechanisms of the Russian secret police from 1917 all the way through to today is about disinformation, forgery of documents, recruiting agents, bribing people, honey trapping, the whole range of operational abuse.
And the bribing is done sometimes with relatively small amounts to pull people in, and then they're caught.
Yes, I mean, once you've bribed, a member of parliament or what I call an agent of influence, someone, a civil servant or official, a secretary who works for a president in a NATO country, once you've got them, then you've got them for almost not for life, but you've recruited them, and that's where they're trapped, really.
And the honey traps as well. I mean, they got a British ambassador with a honey trap. They got secretaries working in German ministries with honey traps. They were very clever at that.
Yes, I mean, there was a Conservative MP in the 1960s called Anthony Courtney. He had a safe Conservative seat in Harrow, and he was a vociferous, strong critic of the Soviet Union and the KGB, very public, and he travelled to Russia. He was actually an advisor to British companies doing business in the Soviet Union in the 1960s, very anti-Soviet, very anti-communist. So the KGB decided to remove him, take him out by a honey trap operation. They honey trapped him while he was on a trip to Moscow, and they took the photographs of him in a hotel room. He was married, and what they did was they had the photographs, and then they had the documents against him. And this is in 1965, and they decided to wait. The next time he criticised the Soviet Union, they anonymously leaked these photographs of the honey trap to 10 Downing Street, to his political opponents. He had a safe Conservative seat in 1965, many thousands. The next year, 1966, he lost his seat with a majority of maybe like 54 votes. So you could actually show how they actually can interfere and remove a member of parliament.
But sometimes they produced fake documents. They tried to expose an American congressman who was hostile to them as a homosexual, which he wasn't. They created false bank accounts for people. Actually, I remember my father, when he was editor of the Times, telling me he got a faked bank statement for Harold Wilson showing he had money in a Swiss bank account, which he refused to do anything about because he assumed it was fake.
Yes.
And I wonder whether that was from the KGB. They were doing all these sorts of things.
Yes. They fabricated a Swiss bank statement for a man called Lord Short. I think he was deputy leader of the Labour Party, maybe deputy prime minister, and they leaked that anonymously. And they were constantly faking documents, particularly in the late 1970s when Carter was president of the United States. There was a man called Brzezinski, who was a national security advisor to Carter in the White House, and they fabricated documents that he was anti-Semitic. And they went after a man called Senator Henry Jackson, who was a very anti-Soviet, anti-communist. He was a Democratic senator. and the KGB tried to investigate him, tried to get what they called compromat on him. But actually, Henry Jackson was actually very boring. They couldn't find anything on him, so they literally fabricated that he was gay and a member of a gay sex club. And in 1976, that was potentially damaging. But they literally would fabricate documents.
And they tried to interfere in US presidential elections. And that's where it moves on to the future, because they did it to Kennedy. They were very hostile to Reagan. But then they did it to Hillary Clinton. And that's no longer the KGB, it's the FSB.
Yes.
It's Putin's team. Now, how do you see that in the long history of the KGB?
Well, Putin obviously was a KGB officer. He was based in Dresden in East Germany at the end of the Cold War. He saw the breakdown of the Soviet Union, and it left a lasting impression on him. And what we're seeing now in the war in Ukraine, he's trying to recreate the Soviet Union. And so his mindset is to use what they call the FSB, which is the successor of the KGB, as a political weapon, and that's what he understands that actually, as the famous Chinese historian said, all warfare is deception. So he understands the importance of influence operations, deception, and for him, the intelligence war is as important as the military war. But the difference from the old days now, with the current FSB in Ukraine and elsewhere, is that they report to Putin himself. In the old days, during the Cold War, the KGB would report to the Communist Party. There was a certain amount of accountability. So the FSB is like Putin's private army. He uses them as a political weapon, not just security.
But using all the same tools, just without the ideological drive, just a personal support
as an agent of the state, but used in a political way. I mean, obviously, any intelligence agency is supposed to protect the security of the state, gather intelligence, but he uses it as a political weapon, as his private army.
Well, Mark, thank you so much. It's a really excellent read. I'd strongly recommend it. And that's all from me. Up next is Patrick Christie's. Patrick, what have you got this evening?
Make sure that you tune in for raw footage of me going to one of these hate marches earlier on and exposing two-tier policing and the reality of what it's like right now outside Parliament. You won't want to miss it.
My goodness, that will be very interesting. How brave of you to go in amongst them. Daniel in the Lion's Den, Patrick in the Hate March. That's all coming up after the weather. I'll be back tomorrow. I won't be back tomorrow at 8 o'clock, actually. I'm doing something else. But there will be a show at 8 o'clock tomorrow. I'm Jake Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation. And you know the weather in Somerset's going to be glorious, regardless of the KGB's best efforts.
Good evening. Alex Burkill here again with your latest GB News weather update. There may be a touch of frost and some fog around as we go overnight, but then heavy rain and strong winds expected in the south as we go through tomorrow, in association with a low pressure system that's currently to the southwest of the UK, making its way in as we go through the next 12 hours or so. As we go overnight, we are going to hold on to the largely cloudy skies across some northern parts, though clearer skies towards the far north of Scotland, allowing for some frost here. Elsewhere, a few pockets of mist and fog perhaps before the wet and windy weather I mentioned earlier pushes in across parts of the south and southwest. This will actually lift temperatures here, and so a milder start for some in the south, but also a wet and windy one, a wet and windy morning for many here as well as that rain pushes its way through. Likely to be some disruption, particularly on the roads through the morning rush hour, and then the heaviest rain and strongest winds do clear away towards the east through the afternoon, but further showery outbreaks following in behind. The best of the sunshine likely to be across parts of Scotland. Temperatures for many down a degree or two compared to today. As we go into Friday, and watch out for a bit of mist and fog and perhaps some frost first thing in some places, but otherwise it's looking like a largely fine day. A few showers to watch out for, but most places staying dry and plenty of sunshine before some wet and windy weather returns from the west as we go into Saturday. So the weekend does look like it will be much more unsettled than through Friday. Heavy rain and strong winds, especially in the west.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Could you be quiet? What is this?
It's my new teeth.
It's your new teeth.
I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for